The village of Harrow's End lay bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, the air thick with the scent of ripe corn and freshly turned earth. It was harvest season, a time when the community gathered to celebrate the land's bounty, to share stories and laughter beneath the broad sky. The festival preparations were in full swing. Stalls were being erected in the square, strings of autumn leaves hung from wooden beams, and the aroma of baking bread mingled with the crisp scent of drying hay. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of his fields, his lean frame silhouetted against the fading sun. His sharp blue eyes scanned the rows of tall stalks that stretched endlessly before him, their golden tassels gleaming as the light caught them. This year, the crops were unlike any he had seen in decades, lush, vibrant, almost unnaturally so. His weathered hands brushed over a stalk's leaves, feeling the thick, waxy texture. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent prosperity, a subtle unease gnawed at him. He had heard the whispers. At first he dismissed them, his mind playing tricks after long days of labor. But now, as twilight deepened and the wind stirred the corn, those faint murmurs seemed to rise and fall like a secret conversation just beyond hearing. No one else spoke openly of it, but he caught the wary glances exchanged between neighbors, the quick hush when a stranger approached. The village felt different, as if a shadow had slipped quietly into its heart. Inside the farmhouse, the kettle boiled over a crackling fire, casting a warm glow on the wooden walls lined with farming tools and well-worn photographs. Eli, Thomas's younger brother, sat uneasily at the kitchen table, his dark eyes wide as he recounted what he had heard the night before. "Thomas, I swear I heard voices, whispers coming from the fields. Not the wind, not any animal, but words. I can't explain it, but it felt like they were calling to me." Thomas sighed, rubbing the tired lines from his forehead. "Eli, you know I don't put stock in old wives' tales. The land's been good to us, and that's all there is to it. Maybe you just had a bad dream." Eli looked down, unconvinced but unwilling to press further. The brothers' conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Maggie Ellis entered, her auburn hair catching the firelight as she smiled gently. "Thomas, there's talk in the village another person's gone missing." The news settled over the room like a cold fog. Thomas's heart tightened. Disappearances were rare in Harrow's End, a place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were hard to keep. And yet, here was a second name being whispered into the growing list. "We need to be careful," Maggie said softly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about this land, old stories, about the cost of prosperity and the price paid in silence." Thomas nodded slowly, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. Outside, the corn rustled once more, the whispers rising with the wind as if the fields themselves were alive and watching. That evening, as darkness cloaked the village, Thomas took his usual walk along the field's edge. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The corn swayed rhythmically, the stalks whispering secrets in a language just out of reach. He stopped, listening intently, his skin prickling. There it was again, a faint voice, a murmur threading through the rustling stalks. It was neither wind nor animal, but something older, something that seemed to pulse with the land itself. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself, though his voice betrayed a tremor of doubt. As he turned to leave, a sudden rustle from deeper in the field startled him. His heart hammered as shadows shifted between the stalks. For a split second, he thought he saw a figure, tall, dark, and fleeting, before it vanished into the night. Returning to the village, Thomas found Sheriff Daniel Crow standing watch outside his office, his face set in a grim line. "You hear anything strange out there?" the sheriff asked, his voice low. Thomas hesitated. "Maybe, but I'm not one for ghost stories." Crow shook his head, his weather-beaten face hardening. Neither am I, but there's talk, and people are scared. We need to keep our eyes open. As the night deepened, the village settled uneasily into silence. Inside their homes, families whispered prayers and clung to old superstitions. But outside, the cornfields whispered on, their voices threading through the wind, growing stronger, calling for something only the darkness could understand. The harvest festival was days away, yet already the shadows had begun to gather, and Thomas Grady, pragmatic and steadfast, found himself standing at the edge of a mystery that threatened to consume everything he held dear. Evening settled over Harrow's End with a slow, creeping weight that seemed to press down on everything beneath the purpling sky. Thomas Grady stood on the worn wooden porch of the Ellis farmhouse, the boards groaning softly beneath his boots as he waited for Maggie to finish her preparations inside. The air held a chill, a breeze rustling the leaves of the ancient oaks and carrying faint, unintelligible whispers from the cornfields beyond the village's edge. Thomas rubbed his hands together, the unease gnawing at the edges of his skepticism. Maggie appeared at the doorway, a small leather-bound book clutched tightly in her hands. Her auburn hair caught the last light of day, and her kind eyes held a solemnity that was new to Thomas. "Come inside," she said quietly, beckoning him into the warm glow of the kitchen. The scent of herbs and wood smoke mingled in the air as they settled opposite each other at the worn table. "You really believe those stories your grandmother told you?" Thomas asked, his voice low but edged with disbelief. Maggie's fingers traced the faded cover of the journal. "I never wanted to believe them either, but something's changed this year. The crops, the whispers, the disappearances. It all fits with what my grandmother said. There's a darkness tied to this land, Thomas. Something old, something that demands a price." Thomas leaned forward, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. "But those are just stories, folk tales passed down to scare children. We're farmers, Maggie. We work the land, we reap what it gives us." She shook her head slowly, flipping the book open to a page filled with cramped handwriting and strange symbols. "Look at this. My grandmother wrote this down years ago, from the old tales and warnings. It speaks of a pact made by the village founders, a covenant with the land that required sacrifice to ensure prosperity." A sudden sharp rap at the door interrupted them. Sheriff Daniel Crow stood on the porch, his stocky frame silhouetted against the fading light. His weather-beaten face was set in a grim expression, eyes scanning the room before settling on Thomas. "Evening, Grady. Heard there's been another disappearance," Crow said, his voice gruff but carrying the weight of growing concern. Thomas nodded. "That's what Maggie and I were just talking about. Something's wrong with this harvest." Crow's gaze hardened. "I don't put much stock in ghost stories and old wives' tales, but the village is on edge. I'm stepping up patrols. No one's to wander near the fields after dark." Maggie exchanged a glance with Thomas, the unspoken fear hanging heavy between them. Later that night, Thomas found himself drawn to the edge of the cornfields. The moon hung low and pale in the sky, casting long shadows that twisted among the rustling stalks. The whispers had grown clearer, more insistent, like voices carried on the wind just beyond comprehension. He paused, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. "Who's there?" he whispered, voice trembling despite his resolve. The rustling intensified, voices overlapping in a sibilant chorus that seemed to seep into his very bones. He staggered back, heart pounding, yet a fierce determination ignited within him. If the land held a dark secret, he would unearth it. For the sake of Harrow's End, for the people he was bound to protect. Days passed, and the village's unease deepened. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, conversations hushed and filled with fear. Sheriff Crow's patrols brought little comfort, his skepticism clashing with the growing dread that gripped the community. Inside Maggie's kitchen, the journal lay open between them, its cryptic passages a grim map to the past. "We have to find out more," Maggie urged. "If this pact is real, if the land demands a sacrifice, then we need to prepare." Thomas nodded slowly, the pragmatist within him battling the rising tide of belief. The echoes of the past were no longer just stories, they were warnings, shadows stretching across the harvest, whispering of darkness that would not be ignored. As the night deepened, the whispers continued, a haunting lullaby that promised dread and demanded a reckoning. Thomas clenched his fists, knowing that the peace of Harrow's end was slipping through their fingers like dry soil. The harvest was no longer a time of joy, was the beginning of a nightmare, and Thomas Grady was determined to face it, no matter the cost. The wind shifted, carrying the whispers once more. The fields were alive with secrets, and the shadows waited patiently. Evening settled over Harrow's End with a quiet that felt heavier than usual, the kind of silence that presses down and makes your skin crawl. Thomas Grady stood on the porch of the village library, the rough wood cool beneath his hands as he leaned forward, squinting at the fragile pages spread before him. Beside him, Maggie Ellis traced her finger along the faded ink, her auburn hair catching the last glimmers of daylight. "These records," she whispered, "they speak of a pact made long ago." Thomas frowned, skepticism tightening his features. Pacts and legends. Nothing but stories to scare children and keep people in line. Maggie's eyes met his, steady and insistent. But what if there's truth to them? What if the land itself demands a price? Outside, the cornfields stretched endlessly, their stalks rustling softly as the wind slipped through. But beneath the gentle susurrus, a whisper threaded a voice too faint to catch clearly, but unsettling nonetheless. "Did you hear that?" Maggie asked, glancing toward the fields. Thomas shook his head. "It's just the wind." But the village was no longer so sure. At the town square earlier that afternoon, a gathering had erupted into a fierce dispute. Some villagers clung to rational explanations. Missing people had run off, perhaps victims of accidents or mischief. Others whispered of curses and dark bargains, their voices trembling with fear. The tension was palpable, like a storm threatening to break. Eli Grady, Thomas's younger brother, was among the believers. That evening, Thomas found him standing at the edge of the cornfield, eyes wide in the moonlight, listening intently. The whispers had grown louder, almost insistent, as if the land itself was calling out. "You have to believe me," Eli said later that night, his voice low and urgent during a tense conversation in Thomas's kitchen. "The whispers, they're real. They know us. They want something." Thomas ran a hand through his graying hair, frustration and fear twisting inside him. "I want to believe you, Eli, but I need proof, something solid." Their words hung in the air, fragile as the flickering oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the cornfields whispered on, carrying secrets that threatened to unravel the very fabric of Harrow's End. As the night deepened, restless villagers tossed and turned in their beds, haunted by the growing chorus of voices from the fields. The seeds of fear had taken root, and with them, the fragile trust of the community began to wither. Thomas and Maggie knew they had to dig deeper to uncover the truth buried beneath centuries of dust and silence. But with each revelation, the shadows grew longer, and the price of knowledge more terrifying. The harvest was coming, and with it, the darkness whispered promises no one could ignore. The chapter closes on Thomas standing once more at the edge of the cornfield, the voices rising around him like a gathering storm. A chill ran down his spine as he braced himself for what was to come. The weight of legacy pressing down like the soil beneath his feet. The whispers were no longer just sounds, they were warnings. And the village was running out of time. The morning of the harvest festival dawned with a deceptive calm over Harrow's End. The sun cast a warm golden glow over the lush fields, the corn standing tall and proud, as if eager to show off its bounty. The village square was alive with preparations. Children ran between stalls adorned with autumnal decorations. The scent of fresh bread and spiced cider wafted through the air, and laughter mingled with the clatter of pots and pans. Yet beneath this cheerful facade, an undercurrent of unease threaded through the crowd. Thomas Grady stood at the edge of the square, his sharp blue eyes scanning the faces of his neighbors. He noted the forced smiles, the quick glances exchanged behind hands, the murmurs that seemed to stop whenever he approached. The disappearance of the third villager, Mary Linton, had come just hours before the festival's opening ceremony, and the shock rippled through the community like a cold wind. "Did you hear? Mary was last seen near the east field," whispered an elderly man to a woman clutching her shawl tighter. No one saw anything, but the corn was moving differently. Thomas's thoughts churned. He had spent the previous night walking the perimeter of his fields, trying to listen to the whispers that had grown louder in recent days. But now, with the festival underway, the whispers had taken on a darker tone, more urgent, more demanding. He made his way toward the cornfields bordering the village, where the tall stalks rustled unnaturally despite the still morning air. As he approached, a strange sensation prickled at his skin, a mixture of cold and dread. Near the edge, he spotted something that made his heart skip a series of symbols etched into the soil and carved into the lower stalks of corn. They were crude but unmistakable, spirals and jagged lines intertwined like a twisted vine. Kneeling down, Thomas traced the markings with a trembling finger. The earth felt cold and damp beneath him, and a faint metallic scent hung in the air. The shadows deepened as clouds passed over the sun, and for a moment, the rustling of the corn seemed to form words, whispers carried on the wind, voices half heard and chilling. Blood, they seemed to say, blood for growth. A sudden rustle to his right made Thomas jerk upright. His eyes darted toward the movement, but all he saw was the swaying corn, the shadows shifting like living things. His breath caught in his throat as a vague humanoid shape flickered at the edge of the field, dissolving into the mist with a whisper that sent shivers down his spine. Without hesitation, Thomas hurried back to the village, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him like a stone. He sought out Maggie Ellis first. She was tending to her small stall, her auburn hair pulled back, her kind eyes narrowing with concern as he approached. "Maggie, you need to see this," Thomas said, his voice low but urgent. Together, they returned to the field. Maggie's gaze grew serious as she examined the symbols. "These markings, they match some of the illustrations in my grandmother's journal," she murmured. "They're warnings, signs of a pact, a demand for sacrifice." Thomas's jaw tightened. But why now? Why the disappearances? Before Maggie could respond, Sheriff Daniel Crow appeared, his weather-beaten face grim. "I heard about Mary," he said. "We're increasing patrols, but the villagers are scared. Some are blaming each other." Thomas met the sheriff's eyes. "We need to understand what we're dealing with. These markings, the whispers, it's not just superstition anymore. Something is coming from the fields, and it's hungry." Sheriff Crow sighed, the skepticism in his gaze giving way to a reluctant acceptance. "All right, Grady, but we'll need more than symbols and whispers if we're going to calm this town. As night fell, the festival's festive lights cast long shadows over the village. But in the distance, the cornfields whispered relentlessly, the voices growing louder, more demanding. The villagers huddled in their homes, eyes darting nervously toward the darkened fields, wondering who might vanish next. Thomas stood once more at the edge of the corn, the cold soil beneath his hands, and listened. The harvest spirit was no longer a distant legend. It was present, palpable, and waiting, and it was thirsting for blood. The chapter closed with Thomas's breath visible in the chill night air as he whispered to the darkness, "We can't let it win, not this year." But deep in the shadows, the whispers twisted like serpents, promising that the price of the harvest was far from paid. The ancestral pact the day had begun under a heavy grey sky, the kind of overcast that seemed to mute the colors of the world and drain the warmth from the air. Thomas Grady stood outside the weathered door of Old Man Harrow's cabin, a knot of unease twisting in his stomach. The old man had requested his company, something rare and always tinged with gravity. Though Thomas was pragmatic and skeptical by nature, he had learned to respect the elder's knowledge, especially when the strange happenings in Harrow's End began to escalate beyond simple explanation. Pushing open the creaking door, Thomas stepped inside. The cabin was dimly lit by a single flickering oil lamp and a small, sputtering fireplace. The scent of dried herbs mingled with the musty odor of old wood and paper. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with jars, trinkets, and dusty tomes. Old Man Harrow sat in a high-backed wooden chair, his bent frame wrapped in a thick shawl. His piercing grey eyes met Thomas's with an intensity that seemed to peer through the veils of time. "You've come at last," the elder rasped, his voice like gravel shifting in a dry stream. "There are things you need to know, lad. Things that have been buried beneath this land for longer than any living soul can remember." Thomas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I need to understand what's happening to the village," he said, his voice steady despite the dread curling within him. Old Man Harrow gestured to a battered wooden table. Upon it lay a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and edges frayed. "This," he said, "is the key. It belonged to one of the village founders, a man who made a choice no living man should ever be forced to make." Carefully, Thomas reached out and opened the journal. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with looping cursive handwriting and strange symbols interspersed with sketches of corn stalks entwined with human figures. As he scanned the text, a story unfolded, a story of desperation and dark bargains. Decades ago, when the village was little more than a scattering of farms struggling against poor soil and harsh seasons, the founders faced ruin. Crops failed, hunger gnawed at their bellies, and death loomed. In their desperation, they turned to an ancient force bound to the land, a spirit neither wholly benevolent nor entirely malevolent, but demanding. A pact was forged, prosperity in exchange for sacrifice. The journal detailed rituals performed in secret, offerings made under moonlight, and the chilling requirement of human blood to nourish the earth. The prosperity that followed had been undeniable. The crops grew tall and golden, feeding generations. But the cost, the journal warned, was a debt that could never be fully repaid. Thomas's heart pounded as he closed the journal. This can't be real," he whispered. "It's just stories." Old Man Harrow shook his head slowly. "Stories that saved us once, and now threaten to consume us. The whispers you hear in the fields, they are the spirit's voice. It hungers still." Later that evening, Thomas met with Maggie Ellis in the quiet of her farmhouse kitchen. The soft glow from a kerosene lamp painted their faces in warm hues, but the atmosphere was anything but comforting. Maggie's auburn hair caught the light as she spread the journal's contents across the table. "I've been through every page," she said, her voice low and urgent. "There are passages here that describe how to break the curse. It won't be easy, and it won't be without risk. But we have to try." Thomas ran a hand through his darkening hair, frustration and fear warring within him. "I want to believe there's a way out, Maggie. But if the spirit demands sacrifice, what hope do we have?" She reached across the table, her eyes steady. "We have each other, and the knowledge that the past doesn't have to dictate the future." That night, Thomas found himself walking the edge of the cornfields, the tall stalks whispering in the cold wind. The moon cast pale light, and shadows danced between the rustling leaves. The whispers were clearer now, a haunting chorus of voices, both pleading and threatening. He clutched the journal tightly, feeling the weight of his ancestors' sins pressing down on him. Could he protect Harrow's end from a darkness born of its own making? Could he face the legacy of blood and shadow without losing himself? The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his answer. As the first light of dawn bled into the sky, Thomas knew the coming days would test every ounce of his resolve. The ancestral pact was no longer a secret buried in dusty pages. It was a living nightmare creeping through the cornfields, whispering for sacrifice and demanding a reckoning. And Thomas Grady would have to decide whether to break the cycle or become part of it. The chapter closes with an unsettling silence, the quiet before the storm, as Harrow's End braces itself for the horrors yet to come. The weight of history presses heavy, and the line between tradition and terror blurs beneath the endless stalks of corn.